At my coach's gym, you broke records, or he broke you first. I was 14 when Coach Raymond Voss grabbed my shoulder after practice and told me I had Olympic potential. The words should have felt like a gift, but his grip was too tight, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. My mom stood 20 feet away talking to another parent, completely unaware that her son's life had just been claimed by a man who collected talented kids the way some people collected trophies. I was a swimmer, decent times for my age group, nothing spectacular yet. But Coach Voss had a reputation for turning regional nobodies into national champions. Parents drove 3 hours each way to get their kids into his program at Titanium Athletics in our small Connecticut town. He'd coached 2 Olympic medalists and a dozen college scholarship athletes. When he said you had potential, you didn't question it. You just worked harder and trusted that his methods, however brutal, would transform you into something extraordinary. The gym occupied an old industrial building near the harbor, all concrete and steel beams and the sharp smell of chlorine mixed with sweat. The pool was Olympic-sized, temperature-controlled, with underwater cameras and timing systems that measured splits to the 100th of a second. Weight room on the second floor, offices in the back, and Coach Voss's domain throughout. He'd built this facility with money from former athletes who credited him with their success, donations from parents who believed he was creating champions. The walls were covered with photos of winners, medals, record boards with times that seemed impossible. Every kid who walked through those doors wanted their name on those boards, wanted Coach Voss to look at them the way he looked at his champions, with pride instead of disappointment. I was no different. I wanted to matter, wanted to be exceptional at something after years of being just okay at everything. My dad had left when I was 11, just stopped coming home one day, and Mom worked double shifts as a nurse to keep our house. Swimming was the one thing I was good at, the one place where effort translated directly into measurable improvement. Seconds and split times didn't lie or leave or disappoint. Coach Voss recognized something in me during that first evaluation, some combination of technique and determination that he thought he could exploit. He told my mom I'd train 6 days a week, morning and evening sessions, with specialized strength training and nutrition plans. The cost was steep, nearly $1,000 monthly. But he offered a partial scholarship because he said I was worth the investment. Mom cried with gratitude, thanking him for believing in me. I watched him accept her thanks with humble grace, already understanding that gratitude was the currency he traded in. The more thankful you were, the more you'd tolerate. Training started the next Monday at 5 in the morning. I showed up in the dark, half asleep, and found 12 other kids already in the pool doing warm-up laps. Coach Voss stood on the deck with a stopwatch and a clipboard, tracking everyone's times, shouting corrections and encouragement in equal measure. He had this way of making you feel seen, like your performance mattered personally to him. When you swam well, he'd clap and call you by name, tell the whole team to watch your technique. When you failed, he'd go silent, and that silence was worse than any yelling. You'd do anything to avoid disappointing him. That was the first lesson. His approval was oxygen, and he controlled how much you got. After 2 weeks, I was already swimming faster than I had all last season. My times dropped consistently, and Coach Voss started pulling me aside after practice to discuss my potential. He'd put his hand on my shoulder, squeeze just slightly too hard, and tell me I could be special if I was willing to sacrifice everything else. The sacrifice started small. He banned junk food entirely, gave me meal plans with exact portions and macros, no birthday cake, no pizza with friends, nothing that wasn't calculated to optimize performance. Then, he restricted social activities, saying I couldn't afford distractions during crucial training periods. School became just the thing I did between practices. Friends stopped inviting me places because I always said no. My entire world contracted to the pool, the weight room, Coach Voss's expectations. He called it dedication. My mom called it impressive discipline. I called it survival, because by then I understood that disappointing him had consequences. Not punishments exactly, but something worse. He'd withdraw his attention, act like you didn't exist, until you begged for another chance to prove yourself. Then he'd give you impossible goals, times you couldn't possibly hit, and watch you destroy yourself trying. When you failed, he'd sigh with theatrical disappointment and say he'd been wrong about you, that you weren't special after all. There was a kid named Austin Mercer who'd been with Coach Voss for 3 years when I started. He was 16, heavily muscled, with times that put him in contention for junior national teams. Coach Voss called him his protege, held him up as proof that the program worked. Austin barely spoke to the rest of us, just trained with mechanical intensity and left immediately after practice. I thought he was arrogant until I saw him vomiting in the locker room after a particularly brutal strength session. He was shaking and crying, whispering that he couldn't do it anymore, that his body was breaking down. I asked if he'd told Coach Voss, and Austin looked at me with hollow eyes and said, Coach already knew. That pushing through pain was part of the process, that champions were built by breaking lesser versions of themselves. He went back to training the next day, and I never saw him show weakness again. 2 months later, Austin collapsed during a race, massive heart, arrhythmia caused by overtraining and dehydration. The ambulance came during evening practice, and we all watched them load him onto a stretcher, while Coach Voss explained to the paramedics that Austin must have had an undiagnosed condition. Austin survived, but never swam competitively again. His parents pulled him from the program and threatened legal action, but Coach Voss had documentation showing Austin had signed medical waivers and followed all safety protocols. The other parents rallied around Coach, defending him at a facility meeting, insisting Austin's collapse was a tragic accident, not evidence of dangerous training methods. They couldn't afford to believe Coach Voss was harmful because they'd invested too much in the dream he was selling. Their kids were still training, still chasing scholarships and medals and Olympic trials. Admitting Coach was dangerous meant admitting they'd sacrificed their children's well-being for glory. So they blamed Austin instead, whispered that he'd been hiding health problems, that he'd pushed himself too hard without telling anyone. Coach Voss emerged from the incident with his reputation intact and even more control over his remaining athletes. He made us all sign additional liability waivers and installed a defibrillator in the facility, performing safety theater while changing nothing about his methods. I was 15 when Coach Voss started touching me inappropriately. Not sexually, at least not in ways I could definitively name, but constantly adjusting my form with hands that lingered too long on my lower back, my thighs, my shoulders. He'd stand close while explaining technique, his breath on my neck, and tell me I had the perfect swimmer's body if I just developed more. The comments about my physique became more frequent and specific. He'd critique my muscle definition in front of the whole team, pinch my stomach, and ask if I'd been following the meal plan, examine me in ways that felt violating, but I couldn't articulate why. When I mentioned it to my mom, she said Coach Voss was just detail-oriented, that elite athletics required that level of physical assessment. She reminded me how much he'd invested in my development, how grateful we should be for his attention. The implication was clear. I was overreacting, being ungrateful, misinterpreting professional coaching as something inappropriate. The training intensified as I got faster. Morning practices became 2 hours of high-intensity intervals that left me gasping and dizzy. Evening sessions focused on strength and technique, with Coach Voss recording every set and reviewing the footage frame by frame, pointing out microscopic flaws. I was swimming 60,000 meters a week, lifting weights 4 days, doing core work daily. My body existed in a constant state of exhaustion and pain. Shoulders that ached with every movement, knees that ground and clicked, hands that shook from fatigue. Coach Voss said pain was weakness leaving the body. That discomfort meant growth. He gave me anti-inflammatory pills from his office when I complained, told me not to bother with doctors who didn't understand athletic training. I took the pills and kept swimming because by then I'd bought into the mythology. I believed the pain had purpose, that suffering now meant triumph later, that Coach Voss was preparing me for greatness through controlled destruction of my weaker self. My times kept dropping. By 16, I was ranked in the top 20 nationally for my age group in 3 events. College scouts were watching me at competitions. Coach Voss told my mom I was on track for a full-ride scholarship to a top program, maybe even Olympic trials if I continued progressing. The validation felt intoxicating after years of feeling ordinary. Finally, I was exceptional at something. Finally, I mattered. The cost seemed worth it because the results were undeniable. I was becoming exactly what Coach Voss promised, a champion built through his methods, proof that his brutal system worked. Other parents looked at me with envy, asked Coach Voss if he'd take their younger children into the program. He'd study the kids carefully, assessing their potential for exploitation, then either accept or decline based on some calculation only he understood. The ones he accepted joined our ranks, and the ones he rejected left grateful he'd even considered them. His power was absolute within that facility. His word was law. There was a girl named Iris Delgado who joined the program when I was 16. She was 14, naturally gifted, with technique so smooth it looked effortless. Coach Voss became obsessed with her immediately, pulled her into private training sessions, gave her even more attention than he gave me. I felt jealous at first, then concerned when I noticed how uncomfortable she looked during those sessions. He touched her constantly, adjusting her posture, holding her hips while explaining body position, running his hands down her spine to check alignment. She started wearing oversized shirts and avoiding eye contact with everyone. I asked her once if she was okay, and she just nodded and walked away quickly. 2 months later, Iris quit the program abruptly, and her parents threatened legal action for sexual harassment. Coach Voss hired an expensive lawyer who argued that coaching swimmers required physical contact, that every touch was documented on training videos, that Iris was a troubled girl making false accusations because she couldn't handle the training demands. The investigation went nowhere. No charges were filed. Coach Voss presented his videos showing him coaching multiple athletes with similar physical corrections, all clinical and professional on camera. What the videos didn't show were the private sessions, the comments whispered where no one else could hear, the way his hands would move just slightly beyond professional necessity when no cameras were pointed at him. Iris and her family gave up and moved away. The remaining parents closed ranks even tighter, convinced now that Coach Voss was being persecuted by people who couldn't handle elite athletic culture. They started a legal defense fund and published letters supporting his character. I watched this happen and said nothing, protecting my own position, complicit through silence. I needed Coach Voss's training and connections for my college recruitment. Speaking up meant destroying my own future. So I rationalized his behavior as aggressive but not criminal, inappropriate but not abusive. Boundary crossing, but necessary for excellence. The mental gymnastics required to maintain that position exhausted me more than the physical training. At 17, I was training 8 to 10 hours daily between pool work, weights, and recovery protocols. My entire identity was swimmer, nothing else remained. I'd stopped attending school except for required classes, completing work online so I could maximize training time. Friends were distant memories. Family was just my mom, who worked constantly to afford my fees and rarely saw me anyway. Coach Voss had successfully isolated me from every support system, leaving only him as the authority figure in my life. He knew everything about me, my body fat percentage, my resting heart rate, my mental state, my fears and insecurities. He used that knowledge strategically, praising me when I needed motivation, criticizing me when I got confident, always keeping me slightly off balance and desperate for his approval. The manipulation was sophisticated and invisible, structured to feel like mentorship rather than abuse. I believed he cared about my success because I needed to believe that. The alternative, that he was exploiting me for his own ego and reputation, was too devastating to accept. The breaking point started at a national championship meet in Texas. I was competing in the 200-meter freestyle, my best event, against the top swimmers in the country. Coach Voss had been drilling me for months, pushing my times lower, demanding perfection. The pressure was immense because college scouts would be watching, and my scholarship offers depended on this performance. I swam the race of my life, touched the wall, and looked at the board. Third place, a personal best time, and a new facility record. I felt euphoric for exactly 10 seconds, until I saw Coach Voss's face. He looked disgusted, disappointed. When I climbed out of the pool, he turned and walked away without a word. I followed him to the warm-up area, confused and hurt, asking what I'd done wrong. He told me third place was first loser, that I'd embarrassed myself and him, that all our work meant nothing if I couldn't finish first. I tried explaining that my time was exceptional, that third at nationals was incredible, but he cut me off and said I clearly didn't want it badly enough. That night in the hotel, I couldn't sleep. Kept replaying the race, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed despite swimming my fastest time ever. Coach Voss had taught me to measure my worth entirely through his assessment, and his assessment was that I'd failed. The next morning, he didn't speak to me during warm-up, acted like I didn't exist. I swam my other events adequately, but not exceptionally. My confidence shattered, and placed 5th and 7th. Flying home, Coach Voss sat rows away from me and talked enthusiastically with other athletes from our facility who'd performed better. The message was clear. I was disposable, replaceable, no longer special. Back home, he cut my training schedule and told my mom he was reconsidering my scholarship because I wasn't showing the mental toughness required for elite competition. My mom begged him to give me another chance, and I watched her humiliate herself pleading with this man who'd engineered my failure deliberately. He finally agreed to continue coaching me, but with new conditions and expectations that would prove my dedication. The new training regime was punishment disguised as opportunity. He doubled my yardage, increased weight loads beyond what my body could safely handle, and scheduled practices at times that made attending school nearly impossible. I was swimming 80,000 meters weekly, lifting until my muscles tore, surviving on 5 hours of sleep and whatever I could eat between sessions. My body started breaking down visibly. Chronic shoulder pain that made raising my arms excruciating. Knee inflammation that never fully subsided. Stress fractures in my feet from excessive kicking drills. I told Coach Voss about the pain, and he gave me stronger anti-inflammatories, told me to ice and keep training. He said I was experiencing normal adaptation, that my body was rebuilding itself stronger, that backing off now would waste months of progress. I believed him because I'd been conditioned to believe him about everything. When your entire identity is constructed around someone else's vision of you, questioning them means questioning your own existence. My mom started noticing the deterioration. I'd lost 20 pounds, looked skeletal despite the muscle mass, moved with visible pain. She asked if the training was too much, and I lied automatically, saying everything was fine, that this was normal for elite athletes preparing for recruitment season. She didn't push further because she wanted to believe me, wanted to believe the sacrifices were worth it, that Coach Voss knew what he was doing. But I caught her watching me sometimes with worry in her eyes, seeing her child disappear into something she didn't understand and couldn't protect me from. One night, she found me collapsed on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m, unable to sleep through the pain, crying from exhaustion and desperation. She held me and asked if I wanted to quit, and I said no immediately, terrified of who I'd be without swimming, without Coach Voss's structure and purpose. She didn't mention quitting. Again after that, just accepted that her son was suffering in pursuit of a dream she couldn't afford to question. In November, during a routine physical required for competition eligibility, the doctor found irregularities in my blood work and cardiac readings. Elevated enzymes indicating muscle breakdown, heart rate variability suggesting overtraining syndrome, stress markers consistent with chronic exhaustion. The doctor wanted to pull me from training immediately for 6 weeks of complete rest. I panicked, knowing Coach Voss would drop me entirely if I missed that much training. I begged the doctor to clear me, promised to reduce my workload, lied about my symptoms. He reluctantly signed the clearance with strict conditions: reduced training volume by half, mandatory rest days, weekly check-ins to monitor recovery. I thanked him and never followed any of his recommendations. I gave Coach Voss an edited version of the doctor's report that downplayed the concerns, and he nodded with satisfaction and told me doctors were overly cautious about athletes who operated at our level. He said my body was adapting to extraordinary demands, that temporary discomfort meant nothing compared to the championships we were chasing. The winter training cycle focused on preparing for spring recruitment, meets where college coaches would make final scholarship decisions. Coach Voss identified 4 competitions where I needed to perform perfectly to secure offers from top programs. He designed training blocks that would peak my performance for those specific weekends, periodization that looked scientific and professional on paper, but required destroying my body repeatedly and hoping it rebuilt in time. I followed the plan exactly, trusting his expertise, ignoring every signal my body sent about imminent failure. By January, I couldn't lift my right arm above my shoulder without stabbing pain. Coach Voss said it was tendinitis, gave me exercises to strengthen the rotator cuff, told me to train through it. By February, the pain had spread to both shoulders and my lower back. Swimming became agony, every stroke a conscious choice to continue despite my body screaming to stop. But I continued, because stopping meant admitting failure, meant losing my identity and future, meant accepting that years of sacrifice had been for nothing. There was another kid in the program named Julian Reeves, 17 like me, training for the same recruitment meets. We'd been friendly but not close, both too consumed by our own survival to build real friendships. In late February, Julian started missing practices, showing up late, performing poorly when he did appear. Coach Voss humiliated him publicly, calling him soft and uncommitted, questioning whether he deserved his spot in the program. One afternoon, Julian didn't show up at all, and Coach Voss announced to the whole team that Julian had quit because he didn't have the mental strength required for champions. 2 days later, Julian's mom called my mom, hysterical, saying Julian had attempted suicide by overdosing on the painkillers he'd been taking to manage training injuries. He survived, but spent weeks in psychiatric care. His mom told mine that Julian had left a note saying he'd rather die than disappoint Coach Voss again, that he couldn't survive the constant pressure and psychological manipulation, that the pain had become unbearable. My mom finally started asking hard questions about the program, about what exactly was happening in that facility. I begged her not to pull me out, explaining that recruitment season was about to start, that I couldn't walk away when I was so close to scholarship offers. She agreed reluctantly, but insisted on attending all my practices and meets, observing Coach Voss directly instead of trusting his carefully managed communications. Her presence changed the dynamic immediately. Coach Voss moderated his behavior, couldn't touch me inappropriately or push me beyond visible limits with her watching. Other parents noticed and started attending more regularly, collective unease building as they actually observed what their children endured daily. Coach Voss maintained his professional facade, but cracks started showing when he couldn't operate with absolute freedom. He scheduled private training sessions before official practice times, trying to maintain control away from parental observation. My mom caught on and started showing up early, sitting in the viewing area, making her surveillance obvious. The silent battle between them escalated, her trying to protect me, him trying to maintain his system, me caught between them, still desperate for his approval, despite everything. The first major recruitment meet was in early March. My shoulders were barely functional by then, held together by anti-inflammatories and sheer stubbornness. I swam poorly, times significantly slower than my season bests, and finished outside the top 10 in both events. College scouts marked me off their lists visibly, crossing out my name on their clipboards. Coach Voss was furious, pulled me aside after and accused me of deliberately sabotaging my performance to punish him. I tried explaining that my body was failing, that I couldn't physically do what he was demanding, but he cut me off and said I was making excuses, that mental weakness was destroying my potential. He told me I had 3 weeks until the next meet to prove I deserved his continued investment. If I couldn't perform, he'd replace me with younger athletes who actually wanted success. The threat was explicit: swim through the pain or lose everything. I chose to continue, injecting cortisone into my shoulders and taking prescription painkillers to numb myself enough to train. My mom found the pills in my swim bag and confronted me that night. I admitted everything: the pain levels, the injuries, the way Coach Voss had been medicating me without proper medical supervision. She went pale and silent, processing the extent of what I'd been enduring. Then she called Coach Voss and told him I was withdrawing from the program immediately, that she wouldn't allow him to destroy her son's body and mind for his ego. He tried his usual manipulation, telling her I was on the verge of major scholarship offers, that quitting now would waste years of work and investment, that she was sabotaging my dreams because she couldn't handle the demands of elite athletics. She hung up on him mid-sentence, the first adult who'd ever successfully resisted his psychological control. That night, she helped me pack all my swim gear and told me we were done with titanium athletics forever. I cried harder than I had since my dad left, grieving the loss of my identity and purpose, terrified of who I'd be without swimming in Coach Voss's structure. The withdrawal was brutal. I'd built my entire life around training schedules and Coach Voss's expectations, and suddenly, that framework vanished. I felt purposeless and lost, wandering through days with nothing to define me. My body slowly started recovering, the constant pain diminishing as inflammation subsided, injuries beginning to heal with actual rest. But mentally, I struggled. Coach Voss had trained me to measure my worth through performance metrics and his approval, and without those measurements, I felt invisible and worthless. My mom got me into therapy with a psychologist who specialized in sports trauma. Dr. Ann Whitmore was maybe 50, calm and patient, and she helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't coaching, but systematic abuse. She explained how Coach Voss had used classical manipulation techniques: isolation from support systems, creation of dependency, intermittent reinforcement, and exploitation of ambition and insecurity. She said athletes were particularly vulnerable because they were trained to ignore pain, trust authority figures, and sacrifice everything for performance. Over weeks of therapy, I started recognizing patterns I'd normalized. The way Coach Voss had deliberately destroyed my confidence, then offered himself as the only path to restoration. How he'd isolated me from family and friends, making me dependent solely on his validation. The physical abuse disguised as training, pushing me beyond medical safety while preventing me from seeking proper care. The sexual boundary violations framed as necessary coaching. The psychological warfare that kept me constantly desperate for approval I could never fully earn. Dr. Whitmore helped me name these experiences as abuse, grooming, and exploitation. She explained that Coach Voss was a predator who identified vulnerable, ambitious kids and consumed them for his own glory. That Austin's collapse, Julian's suicide attempt, Iris's harassment, and my destruction were all inevitable outcomes of his system, not unfortunate accidents. That he'd built a program designed to exploit children while maintaining plausible deniability through liability waivers and professional credentials. In April, my mom contacted a lawyer named Victor Huang who specialized in athletic abuse cases. He reviewed my medical records, therapy notes, the documentation I'd kept of training schedules and Coach Voss's communications, and testimony from my mom about what she'd observed. He said we had a strong case for negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and possibly assault given the inappropriate touching. But he warned that these cases were difficult because athletic culture normalized the very behaviors we were calling abusive, and Coach Voss had carefully documented everything to appear professional and consensual. Juries struggled to understand where intense training ended and abuse began, especially when athletes had achieved success through the programs. Victor recommended we file a civil suit seeking damages and injunctive relief to shut down his program, but cautioned that the process would be long and painful, requiring me to testify about experiences I'd rather forget. We filed the lawsuit in late April, and within days, Coach Voss's legal team responded with aggressive counterclaims. They argued I was a disgruntled former athlete bitter about my own failures, that every aspect of training had followed industry standards and safety protocols, that I'd signed extensive waivers acknowledging the physical demands. They produced videos of me swimming happily at competitions, statements from other athletes praising Coach Voss, documentation of my performance improvements under his coaching. They painted him as a dedicated professional being attacked by ungrateful clients who couldn't accept their own limitations. The legal battle immediately became exactly what Victor had warned: a referendum on athletic culture itself, asking whether extreme training methods that produced results could constitute abuse, even when athletes technically consented to them. The media picked up the story, and suddenly I was defending my experiences to strangers who'd never endured elite athletics and couldn't understand the psychological complexity of coach-athlete relationships. The worst part was watching other parents from Titanium Athletics rally around Coach Voss, defending him publicly and attacking my character. They needed him to be innocent because their children were still training with him, still pursuing the dreams he'd promised to deliver. Admitting he was abusive meant admitting they'd endangered their own kids, which was psychologically unbearable. So they chose to believe I was lying or exaggerating, that my injuries were my own fault, that quitting proved I'd never had true championship mentality. They organized fundraisers for his legal defense and published open letters supporting his methods. Their kids, some of whom I'd trained alongside for years, were pressured into giving statements about what a great coach he was, how he'd never mistreated anyone, how I was obviously disturbed and vindictive. The community that had once celebrated me as a rising champion now treated me as a pariah who'd betrayed one of their heroes. But other voices started emerging too. Austin Mercer's parents contacted Victor after seeing news coverage, offering to share their own experiences and medical records from his collapse. 3 former athletes from years earlier came forward with similar stories of overtraining injuries, inappropriate touching, and psychological manipulation. A woman who'd been on Coach Voss's team in the 1990s testified that he'd sexually harassed her throughout high school, and that she'd been too afraid to report it because he controlled her athletic future. These corroborating accounts built a pattern showing Coach Voss's behavior wasn't isolated incidents, but systematic exploitation spanning decades. Each new witness strengthened our case, but also revealed the scale of damage he'd caused, how many children he'd broken in pursuit of his own glory. Victor assembled everything into a comprehensive filing demonstrating a decades-long pattern of abuse enabled by institutional indifference and cultural normalization of harmful practices. The facility's insurance company settled quietly in July, paying undisclosed damages and requiring Titanium Athletics to implement new safety protocols and oversight. But the criminal investigation continued separately. The State Athletic Commission opened a formal inquiry into Coach Voss's certification and program operations. Police interviewed dozens of former athletes as part of a broader investigation into child endangerment and sexual misconduct. The evidence accumulated slowly but steadily. medical records showing patterns of overtraining injuries, testimony describing psychological manipulation and inappropriate contact, documentation of how he'd overridden medical advice to push injured athletes. By August, prosecutors had enough to file criminal charges for reckless endangerment, assault, and sexual abuse of a minor related to Iris and two other girls who'd come forward after seeing the civil case coverage. Coach Voss maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he was being persecuted for demanding excellence in a culture that had gone soft. His defenders argued that elite athletics required extreme methods, that athletes who couldn't handle the pressure shouldn't pursue competitive sports, that he was being destroyed by vindictive former clients and an overzealous legal system. But the weight of evidence became overwhelming as more victims testified. The trial in October was brief but devastating. 12 former athletes described similar patterns of abuse. Medical experts testified that his training methods created unavoidable injury risks. Psychologists explained the grooming and manipulation techniques he'd employed. The jury heard recordings I'd secretly made of him berating me in private, saw videos showing him touching athletes inappropriately, reviewed medical records documenting the harm he'd caused. The defense offered only character witnesses and arguments about athletic culture, which couldn't overcome the concrete evidence of systematic abuse. The verdict came back guilty on 8 counts, including child endangerment, assault, and sexual misconduct. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison, followed by lifetime ban from coaching minors in any capacity. Titanium Athletics closed permanently. The facility sold to pay legal judgments and settlements. Several of his former champions publicly denounced him, acknowledging finally that their success had come at the cost of their well-being and the destruction of countless other athletes who didn't survive his program. The Olympic Committee launched an investigation into how he'd maintained his reputation despite decades of warning signs, resulting in new oversight requirements for elite training facilities. My story became part of a broader reckoning about abuse in youth athletics, contributing to policy changes around mandatory reporting, medical oversight, and athlete protection. I never swam competitively again. My shoulders were permanently damaged from the overtraining, requiring surgery and extensive physical therapy just to regain normal function. But I found other purposes beyond athletics. I finished high school, got my degree in social work, and now work with youth athletes who've experienced abuse in sports programs. I help them recognize manipulation, understand that their worth isn't determined by performance, connect with resources for recovery. I speak at coaching conferences and athletic programs about the difference between demanding excellence and exploiting vulnerability, about how to create challenging training environments without destroying the humans undergoing that training. I've watched the culture shift slowly, more awareness of the harm caused by win-at-all-costs mentalities, better protections for young athletes, more willingness to question authority figures who demand absolute obedience and sacrifice. My mom and I rebuilt our relationship after years of tension and misunderstanding. She carries tremendous guilt about not protecting me sooner, about trusting Coach Voss's expertise over her own instincts. I've forgiven her because I understand how sophisticated his manipulation was, how he engineered situations to isolate me from support while making it seem like my choice. We both survived something that nearly destroyed our family and emerged with clearer understanding of how systems of power exploit vulnerable people through cultural narratives about sacrifice and excellence. She attends my speaking engagements sometimes, sitting in the audience, bearing witness to how we transformed our trauma into advocacy that protects other families from similar predators. At my coach's gym, you broke records, or he broke you first. I achieved neither, just escaped with my life and enough pieces left to rebuild into someone whole. The records I was chasing meant nothing compared to the person I became after learning that some costs are too high, that glory isn't worth your humanity, that the adults demanding your sacrifice are often the ones who deserve your resistance instead of your trust. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.